Our second guest from the Watershed Watch Salmon Society. We have Lina Azeez and Randy Christensen, Project Manager and Legal Counsel, respectively. Ms. Azeez, you'll be speaking for the 10 minutes?
I'll be sharing my time.
Sharing your time.
Randy, yes.
10 minutes or less. Please proceed.
Okay. Thank you, Honourable Chair and Committee, for inviting Watershed Watch as a witness to this important review. We are honoured to be part of the process. I'm here today with Mr. Randy Christensen, who is our legal counsel. I manage our Connected Waters campaign, which focuses on a specific fish habitat issue I want to ensure the committee is aware of. I have the benefit of working on the ground with community members passionate to restore their local waterways. When my family migrated to Vancouver 14 years ago, I learned the incredible life story of salmon. I was completely inspired, and before I knew it, I had dedicated myself to conservation and protection of these incredible species and their habitats. I've been doing this work for 8 years in BC's Lower Mainland. My organization, Watershed Watch Salmon Society, advocates for BC's wild salmon and the waters that they swim in. Wild salmon are powerful cultural icons in BC, and there is strong public support from across the political spectrum for the conservation of salmon and their habitats. Today's presentation highlights a large amount of salmon habitat in the Lower Fraser that is affected by over 250 kilometers of diking and related flood control infrastructures. The Lower Fraser River was once one of the world's richest mosaics of Pacific salmon habitat. While still valuable, it is heavily degraded through urbanization, agriculture, gravel mining, and continued industrialization of the river. Dikes play a major role in flood control and irrigation in the Lower Fraser River, with about 500 flood boxes and gates on tributaries and sloughs, as highlighted on the maps that we've shared with you. Waterways that once flowed naturally into the Fraser are now severely restricted, creating dead zones with low oxygen levels, poor water quality, limited flow, and disconnected salmon habitat. Few floodgates ever open, and fewer still have fish-friendly pumps or appropriate gates to allow for salmon passage. We estimate 1,125 kilometers of current or potential fish habitat is affected within more than 100 waterways. These waterways provide important nursery habitat for young salmon before they head out to sea. Many of the salmon populations being impacted are important to the people of Greater Vancouver, but many are very depleted and in need of rebuilding. Flood control infrastructure is having a dramatic cumulative impact on the quantity and quality of salmon habitat in the Lower Fraser. This partly because flood control structures are so numerous, and partly because they are usually found on the lower reaches of streams, affecting all upstream habitat. Unfortunately, this fish habitat is not being treated as such under the law. Much of this infrastructure was installed before the habitat provisions of the Fisheries Act were enacted. But despite the 1977 changes to the Fisheries Act, ongoing operations, maintenance, and upgrades are often treated as exempt from the law. For the most part, federal, provincial, regional, and municipal authorities have all avoided addressing fish habitat in these areas. Current flood control standards do not consider fish passage or overall ecosystem health, and DFO provides very little oversight of the impacts resulting from flood protection. So what's the solution? A large percentage of the flood and water control infrastructure that we are concerned about needs refurbishment in the upcoming decades. Much of this work will be supported by federal infrastructure grants. We believe that the federal government should require that any future flood control projects be made fish-friendly. Additionally, a moderate investment to establish a Fraser Valley Salmon and Dike Fund to allow cost sharing of fish-friendly upgrades would assist municipalities and farmers and create major improvements for the fisheries. We suggest, as an interim solution, to establish a 10-year fund with expenditures of $5 million per year. This fund would help with the incremental cost of restoring fish passage while improving flood control in the highest priority areas. I'll now turn it over to Randy Christensen to discuss how the Fisheries Act can and should play a role in addressing the issues I've described.
Thank you to the committee for the opportunity to present. In addition to the work that I do with Watershed Watch, I'm a lawyer with EcoJustice Canada who did a presentation earlier this week. And I'm also an associate with the Polis Water Project at the University of Victoria. Watershed Watch is going to be making a submission that will contain a number of recommendations. I'd like to highlight 3 today. The first recommendation that we have is the restoration and modernization of Section 35. Similar to many other witnesses, we recommend restoration of the pre-2012 prohibition on carrying on any work or undertaking that results in the harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. The definition of fish habitat, strictly speaking, is sufficient to cover the areas of concern in the Fraser Valley. The small streams, side channels, and sloughs behind the flood structures that once provided nursery habitat for millions of juvenile salmon also still support smaller populations of salmon and should be protected under this definition. However, DFO often fails to exercise oversight for these areas. We would ask the committee in their consultations to discuss with local DFO personnel to identify whether the definition of fish habitat is a limitation to their enforcement activities. In the longer term, fish-friendly flood control practices must become the norm through legislation and/or policy. As such, Section 35 authorizations for flood control works are a critical tool to protect fish habitat. These authorizations should be required for works such as flood control infrastructure, and the minister's discretion to grant authorizations should be guided by criteria that consider not only the need for flood control infrastructure, but alternative designs and the value and extent of fish habitat that will be affected. Which leads to our second recommendation, ensuring that federal government funding doesn't harm habitat. As mentioned by Ms. Azeez, many of the maintenance and upgrade projects that will happen in the coming years will be supported by federal government funding through infrastructure grants. This process has already begun with the development of a multi-jurisdictional lower mainland flood management strategy. Federal government funding should not be going to projects that damage fish habitat when other alternatives and mitigation measures are available. Part of the approval process for federal government grants for infrastructure should include screening for the impacts to fish habitat and consideration of alternative measures. One way to ensure this is done is to include flood and water control projects that receive federal funding on the list of projects that are subject to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Other approaches may suffice, but it is essential that federal government spending doesn't damage the very resource it has an obligation to protect and has committed to protecting through instruments such as the wild salmon policy. Our third recommendation is to protect flows as part of fish habitat. Earlier, the committee heard from West Coast Environmental Law that recommended including flows as part of the habitat definition. We would adopt those submissions, and in the interest of time, I'll skip over that, but we're happy to answer questions. But since the 1970s, the understanding of the importance of flows to the overall health of fish and fish habitat has improved dramatically. Flows are now considered a master variable of streams and rivers, a condition that affects all other conditions for fish. Currently, Section 20 of the Fisheries Act contains important powers to ensure the passage of fish and, importantly, to prevent harm to fish. In particular, we would recommend that Section 20 sub 2 sub F add an explicit reference to preventing harm to fish so that it would allow the minister to direct water flows in emergency situations. Section 20 contains a wide range of other powers that are available to the minister that seem to be rarely used. While the provisions of Section 20 are generally sufficient and could be used to great effect, changes to law or policy may be required to ensure that those provisions are actually used when needed. And I'll turn it back to Ms. Azeez for a closing.
When Watershed Watch conducted a survey of British Columbians to understand how people value salmon, 89% of respondents told us that laws meant to protect salmon habitat should be more strictly enforced. 86% of those surveyed agreed that economic growth and development should not come at the expense of wild salmon habitat. Over and over again, at community events, cleanups, and canoe tours, I've heard concerned citizens express their frustrations that their leaders are not acting with the urgency that climate change and other threats require. The federal government has jurisdiction over fisheries. Its responsibilities go beyond just the provisions of the Fisheries Act. There are other important roles that the federal government plays, including, importantly, funding. The work done under the Fisheries Act can be impaired or undone through other government decision-making or simply inaction. That means that to truly regulate and protect the fisheries of Canada, work needs to be done to link infrastructure funding to prepare for a changing climate, protect habitat, and ensure fish-friendly waterways that give salmon a chance to survive. It is imperative that waterways behind dikes are treated as fish habitat. To attain this goal, we strongly recommend establishing a salmon and dike fund as an interim measure until fish-friendly flood control practices become the norm through legislation and policy. It's important that we take steps to restore what was lost, not just what's left, not just protect what's left. And it's equally important to recognize the ecosystem as a natural asset that needs to be nurtured and maintained and invested in, just like any other infrastructure. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to present to the committee, and we'll be happy to address any questions later.